On this show, our featured story is My Brother Martin, a sister remembers growing up with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., written by Christine King Ferris and illustrated by Chris Soonpeat. Our guest reader, Joyce Austin, ESE Coordinator.
Today I'll be reading My Brother Martin. Gather around and listen as I share the childhood memories of my brother, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I am his older sister, and I've known him longer than anyone else. I knew him long before the speeches he gave, and the marches he led, and the prizes he won. I even knew him before he first dreamed the dream that would change the world. We were born in the same room, my brother Martin and I. I was an early baby, born sooner than expected. Mother dear and Daddy placed me in the chifforobe drawer that stood in the corner of their upstairs bedroom. I got a crib a few days afterward. A year and a half later, Martin spent his first night in that hand-me-down crib in the very same room. The house where we were born belonged to my mother dear's parents, our grandparents, the Reverend and Mrs. A.D. Williams. We lived there with them and our Aunt Ida, our grandmother's sister. And not long after my brother Martin, who he called M.L., because he and Daddy had the same name, our baby brother was born. His name was Alfred Daniel, but we called him A.D., after our grandfather. They called me Christine, and like 3 peas in one pod, we grew together. Our days and rooms were filled with adventure, stories, and tinker toys with dolls and Monopoly and Chinese checkers. And although Daddy, who was an important minister, and Mother dear, who was known far and wide as a musician, often had work that took them away from home, our grandmother was always there to take care of us. I remember days sitting at her feet as she and Aunt Ida filled us with grand memories of their childhood and read to us about all the wonderful places in the world. And of course, my brothers and I had each other. We 3 stuck together like the pages of a brand new book. And being normal young children, we were almost always up to something. Our best prank involved a fur piece that belonged to our grandmother. It looked almost alive, with its tiny feet and little head and gleaming glass eyes. So, every once in a while, in the waning light of the evening, we'd tie that fur piece to a stick, and, hiding behind the hedge in front of our house, we would dangle it in front of unsuspecting passers-by. Boy! You could hear the screams of fright all across the neighborhood. Then there was the time Mother dear decided that her children should all learn to play piano. I didn't mind too much, but ML and AD preferred being outside to being stuck inside with our piano teacher, Mr. Mann, who would rap our knuckles with a ruler just for playing the wrong notes. Well, one morning, ML and AD decided to loosen the legs on the piano bench so we wouldn't have to practice. We didn't tell Mr. Mann, and when he sat, crashed, down he went. But mostly we were good, obedient children, and ML did learn to play a few songs on the piano. He even went off to sing with our mother a time or two. Given his love for singing and music, I'm sure he could have become as good a musician as our mother, had his life not called him down a different path. But that's just what his life did. My brothers and I grew up a long time ago, back in a time when certain places in our country had unfair laws that said it was right to keep black people separate because our skin was darker. And our ancestors had been captured in far-off Africa and brought to America as slaves. Atlanta, Georgia, the city in which we were growing up, had those laws. Because of those laws, my family rarely went to the picture shows or visited Grant Park with its famous cyclorama. In fact, to this very day, I don't recall ever seeing my father on a streetcar. Because of those laws and the indignity that went with them, Daddy preferred keeping ML, AD, and me close to home, where we'd be protected. We lived in a neighborhood in Atlanta that's now called Sweet Auburn. It was named for Auburn Avenue, the street that ran in front of our house. On our side of the street stood 2-story frame houses, similar to the one we lived in. Across it, crouched in a line of 1-story row houses, and a store owned by a white family. When we were young, all the children along Auburn Avenue played together, even the 2 boys whose parents owned the store. And since our house was a favorite gathering place, those boys played with us in our backyard and ran with ML and AD to the firehouse on the corner where they watched the engines and the firemen. The thought of not playing with those kids because they were different, because they were white and we were black, never entered our minds. Well, one day ML and AD went to get their playmates from across the street, just that they had done 100 times before. But they came home alone. The boys had told my brothers that they couldn't play together anymore because AD and ML were Negroes. And that was it. Shortly afterward, the family sold the store and moved away. We never saw or heard from them again. Looking back, I realized that it was only a matter of time before the generations of cruelty and injustice that Daddy and Mother Dear and Mama and Aunt Ida had been shielding us from finally broke through. But back then, it was a crushing blow that seemed to come out of nowhere. Why did white people treat colored people so mean? ML asked Mother Dear afterward. And with me and ML and AD standing in front of her, trying our best to understand, Mother Dear gave the reason behind it all. Her words explained the street cars our family avoided and the white-only signs that kept us off the elevator at City Hall. Her words told why there were parks and museums that black people could not visit, and why some restaurants refused to serve us, and why hotels wouldn't give us rooms, and why theaters would only allow us to watch their picture shows from the balcony. But her words also gave us hope. She answered simply, because they just don't understand that everyone is the same. But someday it will be better. And my brother ML looked into our mother's face and said the words I remember to this day. He said, "Mother dear, one day I'm going to turn this world upside down." In the coming years, there would be other reminders of the cruel system called segregation that sought to keep black people down. But it was Daddy who showed ML and AD and me how to speak out against hatred and bigotry and stand up for what's right. Daddy was the minister at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And after losing our playmates, when ML, AD, and I heard our father speak from his pulpit, his words held new meaning. And Daddy practiced what he preached. He always stood up for himself when confronted with hatred and bigotry, and each day he shared his encounters at the dinner table. When a shoe salesman told Daddy and ML that he'd only served them in the back of the store because they were black, Daddy took ML somewhere else to buy new shoes. Another time, a police officer pulled Daddy over and called him boy. Daddy pointed to ML sitting next to him in the car and said, "This is a boy. I am a man. And until you call me one, I will not listen to you." These stories were as nourishing as the food that was set before us. Years would pass, and many new lessons would be learned. There would be numerous speeches and marches and prizes. But my brother never forgot the example of our father or the promise he had made to our mother on the day his friends turned him away. And when he was much older, my brother M.L. dreamed a dream that turned the world upside down.
Our next story is John Henry, an American Legend. Story and pictures by Ezra Jack Keats. Our guest reader, Dr. Oliver Phipps, Assistant Principal at Chatillon Elementary.
Well, hello, thanks for joining me as I read one of my favorite books, John Henry, an American Legend by Ezra Jack Keats. A hush settled over the hills. The sky swirled soundlessly around the moon. The river stopped murmuring. The wind stopped whispering. And the frogs and the owls and the crickets fell silent, all watching and waiting and listening. Then the river roared. The wind whispered and whistled and sang. The frogs croaked, the owls hooted, and all the crickets chirped. Welcome, welcome, echoed through the hills. And John Henry was born with a hammer in his hand. Bang, 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 rang little John Henry's hammer through the cabin as he crawled about. What's that rascal up to now? His mother chuckled, and before she knew it, he was big enough to help her around the house. As he grew up, he did a man's work with his father. One day, John Henry thought, I'm taller and stronger than anyone around. It's time I went out into the world. He said goodbye to his mother and father, and off he went. He worked on farms and in cotton fields, but all that was to tame. So he got himself a job on the riverboat. One stormy night, the ship plowed through the darkness. Suddenly, the big steel rod that turned the paddle wheel broke. The wheel stopped turning. Smash went the rod through the bottom of the ship. Pump water, shouted the captain. Go to port before we sink. John Henry leaped to the paddle wheel crank. He seized it, pushed it, and grunted and pulled. Slowly, the giant wheel turned. With all his strength, he kept it turning. Lord Almighty, help us, someone whispered in that long, dark night. As day broke, they sighted shore and pulled into port. A thunderous cheer went up for John Henry. John Henry felt a new excitement in the air. Men were talking of railroads being built from the Atlantic to the Pacific. They're going to lay those tracks over rivers, across prairies and deserts, and right through mountains, and through Indian lands, and stampeding buffalo herds and badlands. Goodbye, boys, cried John Henry. I'm going to swing me a hammer on them beautiful new tracks. My hands are just itching to hold a hammer again, John Henry said. He tried one for size and laughed. It sure does feel fine. And he drove those spikes, singing to the clanging of his hammer. The men joined in, their voices singing, hammers ringing. And John Henry's gang was in the lead as day after day the tracks moved steadily westward. Rising across their path was a sprawling mountain range. Its snow-capped peaks reached high into the clouds. We'll have to tunnel through, said his friend Lil Bill. It'll be awful dangerous. Could be cave-ins, someone put in. That suits me fine, said John Henry. Me too, added Little Bill. Here's how we'll do it, boys, the foreman called out. A couple of men drive a hole into the rock. Then the powder man will put dynamite into the hole and explode it. The others will cart the loose rock away. We'll do this again and again until we have a tunnel right through this mountain. And it's going to be a real big tunnel, boys. Big enough for a giant locomotive pulling one of them long strings of trains. All right, boys, blast away. Deep into the mountain they worked as John Henry's singing echoed through the tunnel. The powder men got ready to blast more rock. They filled the hole with dynamite, put in a long fuse, and lit it. "Run, men!" cried the foreman. They all scrambled back, ready to dash clear of the blast. At that instant came a great cracking and rumbling, and the entire tunnel trembled around them. "It's a cave-in! We're trapped!" There was no place to run. The fuse burned closer to the dynamite. John Henry was nearest the fuse. He ran to put it out, but tripped and fell. "Oh, I'm hurt bad," he groaned. I can't get up." The fuse burned farther out of reach. Others rushed toward it, but they were too far away. Suddenly, John Henry remembered he still had his hammer in his hand. Down came the hammer, smack, on the burning tip. The fuse was out. Danger past. Sighs of relief filled the smoky tunnel. "Whew! Help me up, boys," mumbled John Henry, clearing their way through the cave-in. The men carried him to safety. Some days later, they heard an unfamiliar clatter. Down the tunnel came a group of men with a strange machine. "This is a steam drill. It can drill more holes faster than any 6 men combined," a new man bragged. "Who can beat that?" John Henry stepped forward. "Try me." He and Lil Bill took their workplaces. John Henry gripped his hammer. Lil Bill clutched his steel drill. "Check the machine," came an order. A nervous hand fell on the switch. In the dark, both sides waiting for the signal to start, a hoarse voice counted, 1, 2, 3. The machine shrieked as it started. John Henry swung his hammer, and a crash of steel on a steel split the air. Clang, bang, clang. The drill got red hot in Lil Bill's hands. He quickly dropped it and picked up another. Hiss, whistle, rattle. Men frantically heaved coal into the hungry, roaring engine and poured water into the steaming boiler. Whoop, clang, whoop, bang. John Henry's hammer whistled as he swung it. Chug, chug, clatter, rattled the machine. Hour after hour raced by. The machine was ahead. "Hand me that 20-pound hammer, Lil Bill." Harder and faster crashed the hammer. Great chunks of rock fell as John Henry ripped hole after hole into the tunnel wall. The machine rattled and whistled and drilled even faster. Friends doused John Henry and Lil Bill with cold water to keep them going. Then John Henry took a deep breath, picked up his sledgehammers and sang, "Ain't no hammer strike such fire, strike like lightning, Lord, and I won't tire. Hammers like this, Lord, there's never been. I'll keep swinging them, Lord, until we win." John Henry swung both mighty hammers faster and faster. He moved so fast the men could only see a blur and sparks from his striking hammers. His strokes rang out like great heartbeats. At the other side of the tunnel, the machine shrieked, groaned, and rattled and drilled. Then all at once, it shook and shuddered. wheezed, and stopped. Frantically, men worked to get it going again, but they couldn't. It had collapsed. John Henry's hammering still rang and echoed through the tunnel with a strong and steady beat. Suddenly, there was a great crash. Light streamed in the dark tunnel. John Henry had broken through. Wild cries of joy burst through the men. Still holding one of his hammers, John Henry stepped out into the glowing light of a dying day. It was the last step he ever took. Even the great heart of John Henry could not bear the strain of his last task. John Henry died with his hammer in his hand. If you listen to the locomotives roaring through the tunnels and across the land, you'll hear them singing of that great steel-driving man, John Henry. Listen. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this story of John Henry. Thanks for joining us for Story Time. We'll see you next time.